Good evening. I'm Peter Keating, the president of the Kennedy School Student Government. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. It's my profound privilege to introduce this year's Class Day speaker, Senator Harris Wofford of Pennsylvania. Last winter, the Kennedy School Student Government Graduation Speaker Committee submitted a list of interesting people to the student body here, and they responded with their votes by asking Harris Wofford to join us for Class Day. Even a cursory glance at Senator Wofford's career reveals why. Class Day is the time we take during commencement week to honor and salute public service. And for over 3 decades, Senator Wofford has been an exemplar of dedication to service. Graduate of the University of Chicago, of Howard Law School, of Yale Law School, student of Mohandas Gandhi, friend of Martin Luther King's. Harris Wofford was, during the 1950s, counsel to Reverend Theodore Hesburgh on the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights. He was a key aide to Senator John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential campaign. Many people realize that during that campaign, John Kennedy and his brother Robert made phone calls on behalf of Martin Luther King, Jr., who was in jail at that time and whose life was in danger in October of 1960. What fewer people know is that that move was publicized to millions of blacks across America by a pamphlet put together by Harris Wofford and Sargent Shriver. It's one example of political savvy that Senator Wofford has demonstrated across his career, and one of many stories of the 1960 campaign and the 1960s and interesting people in Senator Wofford's book of Kennedys and Kings, which is a great read. I've worked for 5 years as a researcher on a book about the Kennedy administration, and there's few people whose memoirs I can say are enjoyable at all. This is one of them. There's also few people who I can say, after leaving the federal government, did not immediately begin working for people who they had worked against during their time in the federal government. Harris Wofford is one of them. After serving as special assistant to President Kennedy on civil rights and chairman of the sub-cabinet group on civil rights, assisting in the creation of the Peace Corps, later becoming associate director of the Peace Corps, Harris Wofford became the founding president of the State University of New York College at Old Westbury, and later was president of Bryn Mawr College. He then practiced law, but he did come back to government as Pennsylvania's Democratic state chairman during the 1986 gubernatorial campaign of Robert Casey. For 4 years, he served as Pennsylvania's State Secretary of Labor and Industry. His achievements there included the establishment of 90 job centers to help displaced workers, the creation of a new Office of Labor Management Cooperation, and the creation of PennServe, the Governor's Office of Citizen Service. But perhaps most importantly, he there met and heard the concerns of many working people across an industrial state. This served him well in last year's campaign for the U.S. Senate. When the late John Hines' Senate seat had to be filled, Governor Casey asked Harris Wofford to fill that seat, and he agreed, and then ran against then Attorney General and former director of the Institute of Politics, Dick Thornburgh. About 1 year ago, then Senator Wofford commissioned a poll which showed him trailing 67-20 in the race against Thornburgh. But he campaigned hard on a platform of national health care, extending unemployment insurance benefits, and giving a voice to the unspoken concerns of very anxious middle and working class people of Pennsylvania. He, of course, beat Dick Thornburgh and is now serving the United States Senate. Former president of the International League for Human Rights, member of the Governing Council of the Wilderness Society, trustee of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. It's my privilege to introduce to you Senator Harris Wofford of Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. Only thing you left out were the things wrong about me. My wife's not here to tell you. But old friends Abe and Tony Shays are here, and they could tell you. And my brother Jack Wofford is here, who was in at the beginning of the Institute of Politics as its associate director. And I thank all of you, and I bring my respects. In a little while, I'll give you my salute to the graduates of tomorrow and to the faculty here. I know that some of you will receive what are called mid-career degrees, and that reminds me of a recent $1 million Hudson Institute study which says that in the next century, the average working adult will pass through 7 different careers. Now, I don't know that I've constantly been retraining, though it sounds like I must have been, Peter. Retraining, as Bob Reich might put it, for higher order, value-added, symbolic analyzing tasks. But in any sense, my own 7th career as the first Democratic senator from Pennsylvania in 23 years did begin here at the Kennedy School. I was at an Institute of Politics workshop, the room right in there, on the idea of national service just over a year ago, and it was there that I learned that Senator John Hines had been killed in a terrible airplane accident not far from our home in Philadelphia. It was a month later that I went to the Senate, determined to make something good come out of the tragedy of John Hines' death. I'm also moved to be here tonight as I was moved last week at the Kennedy Library across the river on the 75th anniversary of John Kennedy's death. Because of the ties that bind this school and me together through my leader in one of those 7 careers. This school is named after him, and most appropriately, therefore, is dedicated to enhancing the professionalism of public management. As someone who's always strived to light fires under governments and bureaucracies since I was a teenager and started lobbying the Senate of the United States when I was 16 years old, I believe deeply in your mission. And, of course, I got to keep my new job by winning that election against one of your former Institute directors, described, as I see the Crimson has done it again, as an aging, nearly anonymous new frontiersman. I was said to be up against a world-class political pro who said he was campaigning as a man who knew Washington inside out and had walked the corridors of power. And you know, campaigning these days, as Mr. Perot is discovering, on a Washington Insider ticket was like campaigning on a pro-leprosy ticket at the time of Jesus. But I was said to be a Bambi up against Godzilla. So I'm here, first of all, to encourage you to go against the odds and take on the Godzillas and even the political pros who may stand in your way as you go forth to your new frontiers. And I salute you as you go forth. Now, that's an old Army Air Corps World War II salute that I gave the very first day when I was nominated for the Senate, despite the fact that, and I kept giving during the campaign, saying, "Your first Democratic senator in 23 years reporting for duty," despite the fact that I had 2 sons in the campaign who said, "It looks stupid. Stop it." But I didn't, and I got here. And last week, talking to John Kennedy Jr. at the Kennedy Library, nearly 30 years after his father's assassination, I really suddenly stood there. I was looking out at John Kennedy's boat in the yard, and I wondered if the reason I saluted maybe sprang from the memory of a little 3-year-old saluting his father's coffin as the caisson rolled toward Arlington. Maybe I've been wanting to salute John Kennedy for 30 years. My remarks tonight are going to try to roll together in one ball a part of Kennedy's unfulfilled legacy that I believe you and I together could fulfill in our time. I'm here to challenge you to join in social invention in one vital sphere to make a reality of John Kennedy's primary proposition that we should ask not what our country can do for us, but what we can do for our country. That salute came to you from my heart because I do know that you are not asking, most of you are not asking, what your country can do for you. Maybe that's a question more often asked by your friends across the river at the business school. And And I'm not sure what to make of the law school these days. But don't take Dan Quayle too seriously. But you're asking instead what you can do for your country, for your community, and your world. I know you're asking that as you wonder whether there's life after this school. There is, of course, much that you can and will do, and my salute goes with you whatever you choose to do, whether or not you catch the ball that I'm going to throw out to you today. But I want to speak tonight not about how we can draw more and better professionals into public service, because that's preaching to the choir in this building. I want to talk about what all of us, as amateurs, as lovers of the common good, that is what all citizens, and especially all young people, can and should do for their country. Now, as my wife says, or better word is complains, for the past 40 years, if you put me down anywhere in the world, my political compass, she predicts, will spin around and point toward the idea of universal service, and especially to the idea of national service by all citizens coming of age in America. And I mean service in the military forces, as well as in what I hope in this post-Cold War world will be much larger civilian citizen forces. And I mean service by all, rich and poor, middle class, high school dropouts and college-bound, young people of all genders and sexual orientations, of all races and cultural backgrounds. All is the great American proposition. This idea of universal service beginning with the young, however, has taken on a new urgency and a new practicality in the aftermath of last month's events in Los Angeles, at a moment when we finally turned our attention to the problems of our inner cities and of our young. It's too bad that to get the nation's attention, we must fall from the high rhetoric of 1,000 points of light to 1,000 fires in Los Angeles. But in our history, it's always been true that on the great problems, it takes great pressure, great struggle, great drama, all too often great tragedy, to get the great action that's required. I'm not just thinking of those who marched and went to jail and died to get the right to vote for black Americans or to bring down the walls of legal segregation. I'm thinking specifically about my last conversation with Martin Luther King. He had reached one mountaintop, but found the promised land still far away over other peaks of a whole range of mountains yet to be crossed. He was beginning to move up the next steep slope, the mountain of poverty in our cities, the mountain of class mixed with race, the mountain that we've not climbed. And he had met defeat in the streets of Chicago, but he was he was heading down to Memphis. Martin raised the possibility, just the possibility, but he raised it, of persuading the people of one of the nation's worst slums to openly, deliberately, peacefully walk out of that slum and, at a publicly stated time, set it afire. To set ablaze, he said, that would sear the conscience of the country, and to go to jail for doing this and stay in jail until the country acted. Now, I doubt that he would have gone that far. But in any case, the fire has come this time again. And one thing we know is that when the fires were set violently in his own day, Martin Luther King's message was not burn, baby, burn. It was learn, baby, learn. Last month, the day after the riots ended, from dawn until dusk, I was in the streets of South Central Los Angeles. I saw the worst and the best of our country. I saw burned out stores, smelled the smoke, talked with people, with pastors and parishioners, with high school students, with young black professionals, with police and National Guardsmen, no older than the young people they were sent to control, and with volunteers cleaning the streets. I saw miles of Los Angeles that had the look of third world cities that I've seen smoldering under police or army rule. Old graffiti was being painted out at one corner while new graffiti was being sprayed on at another, with Los Angeles Police Department SWAT team members looking across their guns at the most frequent slogan on the walls with their fingers on the trigger. Slogans, by and large, said, "Kill the LAPD." An unconcerned young man moved away as we neared the graffiti he had just tagged on the last wall of a burned-out block. It was only his nickname to show he'd been there. "He's a gang leader," said my guide, Tracy Robinson, a specialist on the gangs that he said had enlisted 90,000 young people and caused hundreds of gang-related deaths the previous years. And gangs at this time, unlike a while ago, are well armed. And I saw the better angels of our nature at work that Sunday, men and women of all colors and cultures who were clearing the debris in small teams. With shovels and brooms, thousands of volunteer citizens had responded to the call of Edward James Olmos to join him at 6 a.m. at First and Broadway. The star of Stand and Deliver and Miami Vice had driven around TV station to TV station, going on spontaneously, issuing an appeal to join him in cleaning up the mess caused by the fire, and then going on working together to clean up the mess that caused the fire. "I'm just using my medium," he told me as we walked along Broadway early that Sunday morning. What struck me with special poignancy was that I had seen all this before. 27 years ago, I went to walk the streets after the terrible riots of 1965 had engulfed that section of South Central Los Angeles. The refrain from the 60s song, Then and Now, rang through my head. When will we ever learn? What should we learn from Los Angeles? First of all, I submit that this is not just a crisis of cities or of race, though it is indeed a crisis of both of those. It is, in its most explosive form, a crisis of our young people. That point was put to me all day long, but most vividly perhaps by Pastor A.D. Iverson of the Paradise Baptist Church, South Central Los Angeles. He sat in his dark study without electricity with 2 candles flickering on the table and told me that not all the rioters were black or Hispanic or of any one culture, and he told me about young white kids coming in Volvos, going into electronic stores and carrying out VCRs. But he said, all were young. We are losing our young, he said, to alienation, hopelessness, frustration, and anger, to the epidemic of crack cocaine, to the gangs that replace family, church, or any other institution that instills the values of responsible citizenship and productive workmanship. This was a wake-up call, Pastor Iverson said. Pray God we don't press the snooze button. The lack of good education, the lack of challenging work or good jobs for which they are ready, the lack of constructive alternatives and opportunities for the young, he said, that's the crux of the problem. Then at the end of the day, a remarkable group of volunteer students with whom I met pressed the case that the cause of the alienation among their peers, not among themselves, but among most of their peers, they said, was the sense that they had no way to participate in society, no way to do something important, no alternative form of action than the excitement and the camaraderie of the street gangs. Those high school students and many of the older people with whom I talked pointed to the whole process of coming of age in America. With vivid evidence, they spoke of the need for early childhood education for all. And a lot of the kids had been engaged in some of that work, beginning with prenatal care, good daycare, and Head Start. They liked the idea of using summers to get challenging experience, either in intensive upward-bound learning programs or in outward-bound programs in the wilderness, or in effective apprenticeship programs, or in well-organized, demanding community service corps. They said they would enlist. Great majority of them said they would enlist for a year or more of full-time community or national service after high school, together with other young people from all backgrounds. And that was part of the attraction, too, to work together. If well-organized projects were available and if their living expenses could just be paid. They wanted to tutor younger kids or care for senior citizens, fight graffiti, reclaim neighborhoods from drug dealers, be supplementary community police, repair parks, or rehabilitate homes for the poor. And they argued about which of those projects would be the most important. In any case, they wanted to stop being viewed as the enemy or as a danger and begin to be viewed as a resource, as talent ready, earlier than people think, to make a difference. The toughest indictment of our current dependency system and the best argument of how to change it was put to me a few years ago, this time in Philadelphia, by a young high school dropout. He'd gone from a street gang into the Philadelphia Youth Service Corps. And when I asked him why he had enlisted in the Corps, he first started saying, well, I thought it might be a better gang, different people, wouldn't end by being killed. And then I said, yeah, but why did you say yes? And he said, look, all my life people have been coming to help me. I got tired of people coming to do good against me, he said. This Corps asked me to do the helping. I'm doing something now. I'm making a difference, man. More or less what he said. And I believe that this principle makes all the difference. The saving principle in this life for all of us is to serve and not to be served, to learn responsibility by taking it, to learn citizenship by doing it. Where does this lead? I hope it leads you where it leads me. Believe it or not, it leads me all the way back to the 30s, jumping over the 60s for the time being, for some light on what worked in the Great Depression. We're in a Great Depression of the spirit now, whatever happens to this recession. And to look to the Great Depression of the 30s also to see what went wrong. What worked was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Roosevelt once said it was the best thing he ever did. It enlisted almost 3 million young unemployed Americans in residential, Army-organized camps in or on the edge of our parks and forests. The Corps members of the CCC were challenged to achieve big goals. They worked in projects with demanding leadership. Their success in later years proved that the qualities of productive workers and good citizens are much the same: initiative, responsibility, and teamwork. What worked with FDR and for the CCC Corps members was work, not the dole, not welfare, but work in the nation's service. The young men of the CCC transformed our parks and forests, and you can go to them now, those parks and forests, and you'll find old-timers coming there to show their grandsons what they did in the CCC in the parks. I've met people a half dozen times in Pennsylvania in the last 5 years doing just that. And then they had graduated into the national service of World War II. But most importantly, in transforming our public lands, they transformed themselves. And just as the GI Bill after that war was one of the best investments ever made in America, so was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the story of the boldness and the speed of its creation should give you some sense of possibility for those of you future government servants who've come along in an era when the federal government hasn't been able to take action on any of the great challenges facing our country. Roosevelt showed how fast and efficiently we can get action if we work together and have leadership. A week after outlining the idea of the CCC to Francis Perkins and a couple of his other friends in his Brains Trust, in the middle of March 1933, 1 week later, Roosevelt sent a message to Congress calling for the enactment of the Civilian Conservation Corps. 10 days later, March 31st, 1933, Congress passed and established the Civilian Conservation Corps in a simple 2-page act. FDR set a goal of 250,000 Corps members, he called them boys, in camps by early summer. By the end of July, there were 1,300 camps with over 300,000 young men, as Roosevelt put it, in the woods. One of the leaders in developing the CCC was a colonel on his path up the ranks, George C. Marshall, who managed 17 CCC camps in the Southeast. I've heard of talks of a Marshall Plan today for America. Where is General Marshall now when we need him? Well, after World War II, the CCC was forgotten until the war on poverty was being planned by Sargent Shriver in the 60s. The proposed residential job corps had some of the elements of the CCC, and it's proved very worthwhile. But it was and it is a job training corps, not a service corps. It's an intense form of learning for those who need it most. Sargent Shriver used to say that those who really need a good prep school away from the distractions of their home conditions are not the very rich, but the very poor. He planned for 100,000 young men and women to be in the Job Corps in the first 3 years, and then to go up to 500,000, the estimate of the number needed. It never got beyond 70,000 because of the war in Vietnam. When I had the privilege of helping Sargent Shriver in the early days of the war on poverty, we also envisioned 1 million-strong volunteers in service to America, the Peace Corps come home. But VISTA never passed the 10,000 volunteer mark for the same reason. When the war in Vietnam consumed the attention and resources of the country, the idea of asking all young Americans to serve for a year as volunteers for the rebuilding and education of America was trampled under by the fight over the draft and a war that divided our nation against itself. But the idea of large-scale, universal, voluntary national service has been turned up again by the harsh logic of events that came to a climax in Los Angeles. Let me tell you how, a little more specifically, what I have in mind so that I can throw this ball, this idea for action and social invention, out to you. First, I want to make it clear I'm not proposing the one big federally run domestic Peace Corps that we were thinking of 25 years ago. Instead, I see us coming to a new GI Bill for all young people, with a voucher for a year or two of living expense stipends that could be used to support work in a wide range of service programs run by local, state, or federal governments, or by communities, churches, student organizations, or nonprofit corporations. After which the Corps members would have earned an educational bonus to help pay for college or further job training, or perhaps, as Senator Nunn has proposed, the first down payment on a house. We already have now the National and Community Service Act of 1990 to build on. That is one of the most creative laws that's been drafted in modern times. It's supported by Republicans as well as Democrats, and its crafting and enactment, led by the senior senator from Massachusetts, is another of the many ways Ted Kennedy is carrying on the legacy of his brothers. That act has laid the foundation for the rebirth of the CCC and for other forms of effective youth service corps. Some of the first grants of that commission are about to be made, I think announced next week, and some of the priming of the pump for voluntary national service, some of that priming is going to come your way to this city. Such corps in which the Corps members serve, earn, and learn are an important part of the answer to the crisis of the young. More than 60 such corps are in operation today around the country on a small scale. Pennsylvania is proud to lead the way with the largest number of youth corps of all kinds. Every city, every community can develop one or more. Indeed, I think the very best such effort already underway is right here in Boston, the City Year program, founded by Harvard graduates Alan Casey, who is here in the front row, and Michael Brown. It brings together urban and suburban young people, college-bound and high school dropouts, rich and poor of all colors, in an intensive year-long service corps, almost year-long, 10-month service corps, that offers a weekly stipend of $100 and a $5,000 bonus on graduation. There were 5 applicants for each place last year. I'm told there will be 10 for each place this year. That can be replicated in every part of America. It works. A second building block is Senator Boren's Community Works Progress and Youth Community Corps Programs, ACT, which I'm co-sponsoring along with a dozen of us. Support for 2 new national youth corps that could also be decentralized are key elements of this legislation. A youth community corps would allow secondary school students to earn college scholarships by working on approved community projects after school, on weekends, or in the summer. And a national youth community corps would create dormitory environments, camps, maybe using military unused camps for young people aged 17 to 22 to work on projects ranging from reforestation to auxiliary police work to urban renewal. Help me and our team in the Senate who are pushing this bill to get this passed. Third, we need to reclaim the original idea behind college work-study. When Congress created that program almost 30 years ago, it assumed that most of the jobs for the students earning their way through college would be in the community. But the colleges and universities, bless them, have defined the public service programs that students must work in as college programs on campus, helping those college budgets. I had a GAO study that reported more than 95% of the jobs are on-campus jobs for that purpose. That's an indictment, in my opinion, of the leaders of higher education. And I understand it. I was a college president, and I was part of that whole process. I understand the budget pressures. But join me in asking colleges and universities, and I hope to get Congress to mandate it, to take action so that the majority of those jobs, at least, are, in fact, helping the community. Thank you. I was told all through the campaign that I just don't know how to bring about applause lines, so I'm glad the spirit moved you. Fourth, an expanded investment in the Job Training Partnership Act would be helpful, but there's already more than $1 billion a year in mandated youth programs. I administered about $50 million of it a year of that Job Training Partnership Act program in Pennsylvania. What we need most there is not more money, but is a change in approach. Too often the work experience for youth in those programs is merely make-work jobs, assigned, divvied out to social agencies that don't know quite what to do with the young people coming and don't really want them and don't do anything to change the lives of the young people, let alone accomplish the purported purpose of the summer jobs of the year-long work experience, namely to learn the work ethic. They punch the clock, fill the time, do nothing that will give them the chance to develop kind of skills, self-discipline, self-reliance that will be essential to succeed in the world of work. I went to one place where the summer worker under the Job Training Partnership Act was by a big trash bin, and they explained that all winter long the social agency threw papers in the trash bin that they didn't think they really needed but didn't dare throw away, and they saved them from the summer JATPA worker. You think that changes the life of someone compared to what the experience in City Year in Boston is? These federally funded job programs need to reorganize or be reorganized to focus their efforts along the Youth Corps model. Doing so would make possible a quantum leap in youth service corps without having to spend an additional dollar. Fifth, we should expand VISTA and the Peace Corps. Having been involved in the founding of both, I know that these programs can change lives, not only of those who are helped, but of those who do the helping. Because that's the hidden genius in the idea of service. That's what the Philadelphia Youth Service Corps member understood when he said he was tired of people doing good against him. Let me say it once more. Service is a way of developing the characteristics needed not only for responsible citizens, but for productive workers. Discipline, self-reliance, teamwork, initiative, leadership, and a commitment to lifelong learning. Now, there have been enough pilot programs to prove that this approach works in the 90s as well as it did with the CCC in the 30s. The time has come for the pilots to ignite the whole furnace. This is one idea that transcends politics, conventional politics. It's the politics of service we're talking about. It goes beyond left or right. It draws on the liberal agenda and the conservative agenda at the same time. It's an idea that brings Arthur Ashe and Sam Nunn, Bill Buckley and Bill Clinton, Marion Wright Edelman and Father Hesburgh, Barbara Mikulski and General Schwarzkopf together on the same platform. Work, not welfare, is now a self-evident truth, and we know that we can begin applying this principle to the young. We understand now that personal responsibility and self-esteem can't simply be taught, they have to be earned. We're beginning to see that it is a scandal that we know this, but sit by while another generation of inner-city young people drop out of school or graduate from school into the streets, joblessness, drugs, and the dependency systems of welfare and prison. And it's a scandal that a society with children who need care, roads that need repair, bridges that need building, is allowing and sometimes paying able men and women to sit idle. And it's a scandal, too, that we do not challenge the college-bound to move beyond a self-centered life of civic indifference. Now, in cities today, I saw it in Los Angeles, our country has 10-year-olds pointing loaded guns at each other's heads. It's time for Congress and the White House, Democrats and Republicans, to stop pointing fingers at each other's policies. It's time to sit together around a table and hammer out solutions that do work instead of wasting time and money on those that don't. In our hearts and in our minds, we know why angry, jobless, hopeless young people burn and loot their own communities. We don't need another commission, another study, another pilot program. We need action, immediate and sustained action. So let's begin at the place where we can most agree. Let's commit ourselves to saving another generation of young people by engaging them in the hard work of building their own communities, starting with the rebuilding of Los Angeles by the young of Los Angeles. Let's challenge and enable and empower them to do so. The results will not only bring new hope to our nation, but new purpose. It will also represent a return to the tradition out of which this school grows, a belief that public service fulfills an obligation to our country rather than a privilege the country can bestow. When John Kennedy was asked, "How did you become a hero?" he replied, "I had no choice. They sank my boat." But when he was asked why he entered public service rather than just enjoying his family's wealth, he always explained that he felt obligated to serve. He loved politics. He was a happy warrior, but he felt obligated to serve. He didn't say that he had $100 million to spare, so he might as well run for president, or $300 million. He simply said he owed it to his country. Now, that was a powerful ethic, an ethic we must return to today if we're to break the gridlock in Washington and take the kind of action the people of this country are calling for, to rebuild our economy, reclaim our cities, protect our environment, and make the right to affordable health care a reality for all Americans. That's an ethic we need to put into action before the problems mounting around us do indeed sink our boat. Let's begin building that ethic in our youngest citizens. I'm all for a pincers movement to gather the older citizens, those of us 65 and above, into the action too. And I'm for making sure that we, each of us, maintain that ethic of service in our careers, whichever career we choose. Now, the best commencement address I ever heard was given by the teacher that meant the most to me, though never, unfortunately, a teacher I had in a classroom, Scott Buchanan, the philosopher and founder of the Great Books program of St. John's College in Annapolis. I heard him tell the graduates of St. John in 1952 not to be overawed by the systems, ideologies, and worlds around them, because for all their high and mighty poses, they are only possibilities which with boldness, laughter, and ingenuity on our part can be set aside and replaced. For the best of all possible worlds, he said, is yet to be found if Satan is to be confounded and God is to be justified. Now, that is also John Kennedy's approach. I'll never forget his mandate to me as he assigned me to help him organize executive action for civil rights, help him use the power of the presidency to achieve the full constitutional rights for all Americans. He didn't give me a lot of rhetoric. His job description was just this: Harris, you know what we need to do in civil rights. Go do it. Well, as you can guess, that's my mandate to you tonight. You know much of what needs to be done in America and for America. With boldness, laughter, and ingenuity, go do it.
Thank you, Senator Wofford. I would just like to say that this year in particular, with hundreds of public officials running away from government, some out of frustration, many out of fear, we're privileged to have with us tonight someone who ran his first campaign for elective office at the age, well, at an advanced age, and who is bringing his considerable energies to re-energizing the concept of public service. Senator Wofford would like to take Q&A. We don't have microphones set up for your questions. So the Senator will ask you to raise your hand. He'll call on people. Just speak loud enough so that people can hear you, and we'll go with that for 10 or 15 minutes.
Who would like to ask the first? Yes. Well, all right, that's a good one, good hard one. Could you hear get the general point? He'd like me to look into the crystal ball and also give my best judgment about what is going to happen in the political race, whether Clinton can possibly win, whether the Democrats are going to go ahead and nominate somebody that's probably going to lose. But he added that we've got 4 months to go, and I would like to begin by saying that for those of you who well, let me say, I've been to every Democratic convention since 1948, and I can remember almost none except Lyndon Johnson in Atlantic City, and there we learned afterwards that Lyndon Johnson was scared to death and in fact had the FBI tapping some phones to find out whether Robert Kennedy was going to, at the last moment, try to unseat him from a nomination. Everybody assured he had. I haven't been to hardly a Democratic convention where until the convention, the Democrats had united around a candidate, and it's being treated as news that the majority of people would say they'd like somebody other than Bill Clinton. I can assure you that in 1960, the majority of people, if polled, in the Democratic Party would have preferred Adlai Stevenson, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, Scoop Jackson, Senator Symington, or someone else, or none of the above but not John Kennedy, right up to the eve of the convention, even though he had a majority of the delegates. And the night before the convention, John Kennedy, Eleanor Roosevelt stood on a table I was one of 700 delegates probably, I've never been there legally yet as a delegate. I was, but saying John Kennedy doesn't have the character to be president of the United States. He may have written profiles in courage, but he didn't have a profile in courage to stand up to Senator Joe McCarthy, and we must turn to Adlai Stevenson, who the nation wants. And she drew Adlai to the table, and reluctantly at last, having agonized for months, he agreed to go forth to seek the nomination. There were 10,000 people ringing the arena, chanting for Stevenson. The galleries were packed for Stevenson, and we really felt that though we had a numerical majority of the delegates, that tide could turn right at the convention. So it's just is earlier than you think as to what the Democratic Party is going to do when the choice is between George Bush, whom two-thirds of the people now are indicating they don't want to have another term, and God knows, if I may say so, from where I sit in my perch, 4 more years of every major goal that I'm interested in being blocked, being vetoed by a government of veto is not going to just frustrate me, because I'm a long march type and I've started late in the Senate, so I'm not leaving the Senate. But for our country, 4 more years of no fundamental action on the greatest measures of the day. I'm saying this in spirit of the candor of this place, and I apologize to those that may on this occasion with their families disagree with me. I wouldn't be here but for about 500,000 Republican votes in Pennsylvania. But that is what I believe. And I believe that when we get to the choice of Perot, Bush, or Clinton, you're going to find a lot of Democrats coming home. And of the two-thirds of the people that seem to want a fundamental change, I'm not at all sure that as Mr. Perot goes through the fiery ordeal that Bill Clinton has been through, that the judgment of the people thereafter is that the best person to get effective government and break the gridlock in Washington and bring Congress and the executive together for action in 100 days or 1,000 days of action is a billionaire businessman who's willing to put $100 or $300 million on the table. I have to also tell you that I didn't come to endorsing Clinton out of reluctant compromise. I had worked with him in the National Governors Association for 4 years on several task forces, including the idea of national service, which he is very much in line with, I think, every point that I put forward to you today. And he makes that point in a lot of places, and he may have talked about it here when he was here in outline. I was enthusiastic about Clinton for some years. I was grounded because of my respect and affection for Paul Tsongas, who was Peace Corps star volunteer in Ethiopia in the 2 years I was there with him, and a wonderful man, and I could not do anything to undermine his campaign. When he dropped out, I immediately joined Clinton. I was with him night and day in Pennsylvania. I think he is in the tradition of the perhaps flawed happy warriors like Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, and that he is going to, before this campaign ends, catch the imagination of the people. But everything is open, and I think this is going to be a great season for America, because I think people who disagree with me and agree with me are going to sense that this may be a turning point election like 1932 and 1960, and that it may be a very close one, and it may be one in which we can make a difference, and you can make a difference in how you finally make the judgment. 100,000 votes, 1 vote in each precinct in America, made the difference in 1960 between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. And I think we're in for that kind of a season. So let's continue the debate. That's where I stand today, and I'm going to work hard for what I believe. But this is a time when... yes, thank you. Well, that's one way to stop me. Well, I think you're going to find it'll be a cutting-edge issue in the presidential campaign. I listened to Clinton on the C-SPAN at night at 2:50 a.m. the other day in Berkeley. He put forth as 2 major reforms he would have in the first 100 days of his administration was comprehensive national health insurance affordable for all Americans, and 2, national service plan. Throughout Pennsylvania, he made that as one of his main pledges to the people in Pennsylvania. When he came and met with the Democratic senators, he put it at the top of his agenda for what he would expect to work together with the Senate on if he were president. In the primaries, it did not become a major issue, and it was a great disappointment to Senator Bob Kerrey, who had been in the lead in this in many ways, because not that people are not concerned about this, but because as soon as Bob Kerrey put forth his very specific and bold plan, the other candidates all said, we are going to have fundamental health care reform, affordable and available for all Americans, and some suggested another approach, and some kept it rather general, as I had in my Pennsylvania campaign, and it wasn't an issue in the primaries. But between George Bush, who has put on the table the most pathetic proposals in terms of fundamental reform, proposals which will add to the complexity of the system, which I do not think will cut down on the costs, and which will only extend service to, I think, a small fraction of those who are not covered, and who said he will veto any fundamental compromise, a system that goes to anything like universal health insurance. Between George Bush and Bill Clinton, there's going to be a very sharp issue on this. I think you'll find that it's an issue that concerns a lot of Americans, not just the 37 million who are not covered. Most of all, those that are fearful that it's going to bankrupt them, or when they need health care, they won't have it. When they lose a job or change a job, it won't be available. It's a fear that my own wife had with the pre-existing condition she has that calls for service now, that if I lost my job last November, neither of us would have been covered, and she feared that we would not get coverage because of her condition. It's a fear that's very widespread. I think Pennsylvania was representative, and we're going to discover that there's a great response to that issue. Where Perot is in this, I haven't any idea on this or on most other issues. Yes, in red, and then... Well, I agree with you. I hope that as you test our office, you won't find that's the reaction. Well, Philadelphia? Right. Well, go down and talk to Priscilla Pearson with me. She's our new head of Constituent Services, and she's red hot on all the points that you're just describing. Well, just speaking for myself, I've been holding roundtables all over the state very, very regularly. It's my own preferred form of sitting around a table with 20 or 30 people, and other people can listen, but going at it for a couple of hours. I'm also going to, once a month, spend a day at some kind of a job, or the other kind of job than the kind I have now, some other job, in a hospital. And I've done one day teaching. I intend to do all kinds of jobs, and then at the end of the day, have a working session with the people, my colleagues in that job, to talk about how they see things at home and in Washington. I'd be very interested in any ideas you have to get a system to be more responsive than we are. There's nothing that I want more of. One of the first letters I got from a constituent after it was my own letter to a constituent thanking him for support and for a donation, and he sent the letter back, and I pledged to be working night and day for national health insurance, which I am. And he said, "Senator, don't let all this go to your head. I didn't vote for you because I liked you. I don't know you well enough to know whether I would. I didn't vote for you because I like the idea of national health insurance. I don't think I do. I voted for you because I couldn't stand the other fellow. And I don't like most of the rest of them down there. Don't become one of them." So I have my own little oath not to become one of them in that sense. And I'll be glad to sit down and plot with you how to... Sure. I agree with you.
And you have to listen to the people.
I second all of that. Yes?
You made a very pointed statement about the fact that Senator Kennedy did not run for president because he had $100 million of his own money. And that makes me suspect that you probably have some strong views about campaign financing and reform and things of those sorts. In 1960, there was no taxpayer funding, no taxpayer financing of presidential elections. As you point out, Senator Kennedy, being the first Catholic to seriously contest the nomination, was not supported by the majority of his party until near the end.
Right.
So that leaves only...
And not by the majority of Catholics, I should also say. I was at Notre Dame Law School, and I wasn't a Catholic then, and I found that I was one of the few people that was really supporting John Kennedy, and most of the Catholics were afraid that it would produce an anti-Catholicism. This is the egghead Catholics at Notre Dame, if they voted for John Kennedy, until the Wisconsin primary began to make them think, well, he maybe really can do it.
So in that context, that only leaves either the Republicans or Senator Kennedy's own millions that financed his campaign. Well, I'm getting my question. So, given that whatever the answer is, and I'm interested in your answer to that, and then in the larger question of what's your views on campaign financing reform?
Well, the Kennedys are the most generous people in terms of public service, but may I just put it mildly, they're not the most generous in terms of what they contribute to their own or to campaigns. Though they were within the present limitations very kind to me. The money of the 1960 campaign I was involved in trying to raise, we scrounged everywhere, and very little of that presidential campaign actually came from the family. In any case, we're in a new era now. I think there's nothing, I think there are some things more important than a campaign reform, some very fundamental things, but we may not be able to get them without campaign financing reform. So it's a crucial issue for me. It is a very complex issue, as we all know who have really worked with it. I promise also not to let complexity be the excuse for doing nothing. But let me just give you an example of the complexity that argues, I think, essentially for public funding of elections. The limit to $1,000 per person, for somebody like me, I think has had no valuable effect in terms of reducing the pressures. It has increased infinitely the pressures on how you raise enough money to run against somebody who will have presumably 2 times as much money as you have. To get $10,000, you now have to, assuming you could get $1,000 for people, you now have to reach 10 people instead of 1. Secondly, I know people think that the money has sort of a direct influence on politicians, and it probably does for some. But I can honestly tell you that there are 2,000 or 3,000 people that gave $1,000 or more to my campaign, and I can't remember who they are. Worse than that, when I meet somebody who I knew we hoped would give, I have a panic as did he or she or did they not, and I usually err on the side of suggesting that I want to thank them. But it's overstated that the difference between $1,000 and what could have been given before really makes that difference. Money as a whole, and for me the worst of it is 2/3 of your time or something like that as a candidate on a statewide election in any case is spent raising money. And maybe the worst thing is you don't have time to think and to be creative because you're spending so much time raising money. It isn't that all these diverse people from whom I raise money are going to influence me very much. In fact, the first businessman that really supported me urged the governor to appoint me, my best friend in business, head of a major corporation, had a major issue up. It was the first issue I had to deal with, and I called it the other way and supported another. This was the Bell versus the AT&T issue that came up. And I say other people may be different, but I don't think it's so different. But the amount of time, the consuming quality of raising money is absolutely corrosive of the process. So, yes, I hope that it will be on the agenda for the first 100 days of a new Democratic administration. We passed a bill that Bush has vetoed. Has he vetoed it or just said he was going to veto it? I think he has vetoed it. He immediately said he was going to, and I didn't remember when he signed it. It was a good step in the right direction. It wasn't far enough. But I think the majority of Democrats, a large majority, are committed to fundamental campaign reform. But you need a president that isn't going to veto it. And you need a fire continuing to be built. I hope Jerry Brown's campaign has helped fuel that fire and that it won't go out. One or two more? Why don't you see me afterwards and give me some counsel on what you'd put on my agenda for action on that.
I saw a documentary report recently on reinstituting the CCC and WPA, and one of the points that was made
by and large, the studies I've read said that they did very well in the combination of Army and private citizens that they engaged for the leadership of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The extraordinary educational programs that were put on at night and on Saturdays and on sometimes Corps days have been documented, and I've looked at some of the records of them, and it was an extraordinary sort of inventive program, very intense and structured. The WPA on many projects took big building assignments, and WPA workers were part of building projects. In many cases, they were assigned to agencies, ground maintenance staffs, and they were sort of the bottom workers in the maintenance staff, and they earned the reputation of raking leaves because they were seen doing that. There were a lot of jokes about the WPA. And in it is a warning that if you just think of work and then, in some cases, make up the work and divvy out or assign the worker to a variety of these jobs, there's no assurance at all that it will be structured in a challenging way. And that is what a lot of the job training partnership at work experience is. One of the community colleges in Pennsylvania had young people every summer for 20 years in the Job Training Partnership Act program. And I said, what do you do with them? And he said, well, they're assigned to the maintenance crew, and they pick up trash and they do odd jobs, the president said. This is a president, a real champion of national service and community service. And I said, well, what do they get out of it? He said, well, I thought all they wanted in that program was to learn the work ethic. And I said, well, do you think they are doing it? And he laughed and he said, not if they're working with our maintenance crew. They're not learning the work ethic. And I said, well, why don't you take the responsibility of organizing, I think they had 20 every summer, those 20 into 2 teams and do things with them. Send them to a wilderness week in the beginning. Give them some big projects. Maybe it will be making the campus beautiful. Maybe it's the same kind of work, but do it in a structured, challenging form with some leadership. And they did it, and it made all the difference. So that's part of what I was presenting right here today. I'm missing one part of what you said, but that I think probably is enough of an answer. Oh, you were pointing out that young people are so different. I've been looking into that to see how different they were. A lot of very badly educated rural poor, demoralized rural poor were in the CCC program. It may have been the first agency to declare there should be no racial discrimination, because there in that statute in 1933 is a provision in the admission and policies of the CCC, there shall be no discrimination by race. And that's at a time when the military and most of our federal institutions, most of them I think, were segregated. Though black Americans were in numerically much less part of it. I think somebody told me there was about 10% who were in the CCC programs. But the myth that they were all highly motivated young men at a time when the great majority of our people didn't get through high school, I think that's probably a myth, and that there wasn't such a high standard then and such a low standard now. But I don't mean to minimize the problems of today, but I'm not proposing I'm proposing that we become more inventive if we're going to do our duty, and being inventive is going to know what our materials are, and the materials may be more challenging and more difficult today. That's why you're going to have such an interesting time as you go do it. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. There's going to be a reception now right in back of the forum to which you're all invited. Have a happy tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Thank you.